Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 12th, and we're looking back 83 years to November 12th, 1942. Just after midnight, in the dark waters off a small Pacific island called Guadalcanal, American and Japanese warships collided in one of the most brutal naval battles in history. Ships fired at point-blank range. Torpedoes crisscrossed the black water. Vessels exploded, burned, and sank within minutes. The fighting was so close and chaotic that sailors could see the faces of enemy sailors on nearby ships, illuminated by muzzle flashes and burning oil. The first naval battle of Guadalcanal, as it came to be known, lasted just over 30 minutes. But in that half hour of desperate violence, the course of the Pacific War shifted. Japan's offensive momentum, which had carried them across half the Pacific in less than a year, was finally broken. America began the long, bloody road to victory, and thousands of young men, American and Japanese alike, died in the darkness, fighting for control of an obscure island that would become one of World War II's most significant battlegrounds. The battle for Guadalcanal represents a crucial turning point, not just in the Pacific War, but in the global conflict that would determine the 20th century's course. To understand why this naval battle mattered so much, we need to understand Guadalcanal's strategic importance. In early 1942, Japan seemed unstoppable. In less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous Pacific islands. They had pushed to the doorstep of Australia and threatened to cut the supply lines between the United States and its allies in the South Pacific. Guadalcanal, part of the Solomon Islands, was a small malaria-infested jungle island that most Americans had never heard of. But in mid-1942, Japan began constructing an airfield there. If completed, this airfield would give Japanese bombers the range to strike Allied shipping lanes and threaten Australia itself. The island sat at a strategic crossroads. Whoever controlled it could project air power across a vast area of the South Pacific. The United States couldn't allow Japan to complete that airfield. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in America's first major offensive operation of the war. They quickly seized the partially completed airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field. But taking the airfield was the easy part. Holding it would require 6 months of some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific War. The Japanese were determined to recapture Guadalcanal. They poured troops onto the island and launched repeated ground assaults against the Marines, defending Henderson Field. But ground combat alone couldn't decide the battle. Control of the sea approaches to Guadalcanal would determine whether each side could resupply and reinforce its forces. Whichever navy controlled the waters around the island would ultimately control the island itself. By November 1942, both sides were exhausted but committed. Casualties, disease, and lack of supplies depleted the Marines on Guadalcanal. The Japanese garrison was in similar condition. Both sides needed reinforcements desperately, and both sides knew that major naval convoys were approaching Guadalcanal, convoys that would determine the island's fate. The Japanese plan was ambitious and complex. They would use their navy to achieve two objectives simultaneously. First, they would bombard Henderson Field with battleship guns, destroying American aircraft and making the airfield unusable. Second, they would escort troop transports carrying 13,000 fresh soldiers to reinforce the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. These reinforcements would then launch a massive assault to recapture Henderson Field. The bombardment force included two battleships, He and Kirishima, along with cruisers and destroyers. Japanese battleships carried massive 14-inch guns capable of devastating Henderson Field from offshore. If the airfield was neutralized, American aircraft couldn't interfere with the landing of Japanese reinforcements the next day. The plan was sound, but it required the Japanese fleet to survive its passage to Guadalcanal and execute the bombardment without being intercepted. American intelligence had detected the Japanese convoy, and the U.S. Navy was preparing to stop it. The American force, commanded by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, was outgunned. Callahan had 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, but no battleships. His ships were also not trained to fight together. They had been assembled hastily from different units. In a daylight engagement, American aircraft from Henderson Field could have evened the odds. But this battle would be fought at night, when aircraft couldn't operate effectively. It would be ship against ship in darkness, precisely the kind of close-quarters battle where Japanese training and experience gave them advantages. Callahan knew he was overmatched, but he also knew that if the Japanese battleships reached the bombardment range of Henderson Field, the airfield would be destroyed and the battle for Guadalcanal would likely be lost. He had to stop them, regardless of the cost. Shortly after midnight on November 13th, 1942, the two forces collided in the waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. What followed was chaos. Naval battles usually took place at distances of miles, with ships maneuvering carefully and firing at distant targets. This battle was different. The opposing forces stumbled into each other at close range in complete darkness. Ships were suddenly firing at targets just hundreds of yards away. The American destroyer Cushing nearly collided with the Japanese battleship Hiei. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness. Ships fired torpedoes at almost point-blank range. The orderly formations and battle plans both sides had prepared dissolved into a confused melee where individual ship captains made split-second decisions with limited information. The fighting was extraordinarily violent. The American destroyers, small and lightly armored, charged directly at the Japanese battleships, like dogs attacking bears. They fired torpedoes and shells at close range, knowing they were likely sailing to their deaths, but determined to disrupt the Japanese formation and give the cruisers opportunities to attack. The destroyer Laffey sailed so close to the battleship Hiei that Japanese guns couldn't depress low enough to hit her. Laffey's guns fired directly into Hiei's superstructure at point-blank range, killing the battleship's steering crew and jamming her rudder. But Laffey's desperate attack cost her everything. Overwhelmed by fire from multiple Japanese ships, she was blown apart and sank within minutes. Admiral Callahan's flagship, the cruiser San Francisco, engaged in a gun duel with Hiei at a range of less than 3,000 yards, absurdly close for capital ships. San Francisco's bridge was hit repeatedly. Callahan and most of his staff were killed instantly. The ship's captain was mortally wounded. Yet San Francisco kept fighting, her surviving crew continuing to engage Japanese ships even as their vessel burned and listed. The destroyer Monson was caught between multiple Japanese ships and pounded by gunfire from all directions. Within minutes, she was a burning wreck. The cruiser Atlanta took friendly fire from San Francisco in the confusion, then was torpedoed by a Japanese destroyer. She was later scuttled. A torpedo hit the destroyer Barton and broke in half, sinking in less than a minute. Japanese ships suffered heavily too. The battleship Hiei, damaged by close-range fire from multiple American ships, had her steering destroyed. She could only sail in circles. At daylight, unable to escape, she would be attacked by American aircraft and eventually scuttled by her own crew. The destroyer Akatsuki was destroyed by American gunfire early in the battle. The destroyer Udachi was so badly damaged that she had to be abandoned. By 1:30 a.m., after just over 30 minutes of fighting, the battle was over. Both sides broke contact and withdrew. The waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island were filled with burning ships, floating debris, and hundreds of sailors struggling to survive in oil-slicked water. The butcher's bill was horrific. The U.S. Navy lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. Every American ship that participated in the battle was damaged. More than 1,400 American sailors were killed, including 2 admirals and numerous senior officers. It was one of the U.S. Navy's costliest battles of the entire war. But the mission was accomplished. The Japanese bombardment force had been stopped. Hiei, unable to steer, limped away from Guadalcanal, but was caught by American aircraft the next day and sunk. The Japanese never reached Henderson Field. The airfield remained operational, and because the airfield remained operational, American aircraft could attack the Japanese troop transports approaching Guadalcanal. Over the following days, American planes sank 7 of the 11 Japanese transports carrying those 13,000 reinforcements. Only 2,000 Japanese soldiers made it ashore, and they arrived without equipment or supplies. The massive Japanese offensive to recapture Henderson Field never materialized. The Japanese would make one more attempt to bombard Henderson Field 2 nights later, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, but that attack was also repulsed, with another Japanese battleship, Kirishima, sunk. The naval battles of Guadalcanal marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Solomon Islands. Japan would fight desperately to hold what it had, but it would never again seriously threaten to recapture Guadalcanal. The tide had turned. The battle for Guadalcanal continued until February 1943, when Japan finally evacuated its remaining forces from the island. But the naval battles in November 1942 determined the outcome. Once Japan failed to destroy Henderson Field and land significant reinforcements, the campaign's momentum shifted irreversibly toward the United States. Guadalcanal was significant not because of the island itself, but because it demonstrated that Japan's defensive perimeter could be breached. For months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had seemed invincible. But at Guadalcanal, American forces proved they could take Japanese-held territory and hold it despite determined counterattacks. This success provided a template for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually carry American forces to Japan's doorstep. The battle also illustrated the nature of the Pacific War. Unlike the European theater, where great armies clashed on land, the Pacific War centered on control of the sea and air. Islands were important, primarily as bases for aircraft and ships. The side that controlled the approaches to an island could supply its garrison. The side that couldn't control the approaches would eventually be starved out, no matter how many soldiers it had ashore. The naval battle of Guadalcanal demonstrated that the U.S. Navy, despite earlier defeats at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and elsewhere could match Japan's once feared navy. The American sailors who fought that night were not more skilled than their Japanese counterparts. In fact, Japanese night fighting tactics and training were superior. But the Americans fought with desperate determination, willing to sacrifice their ships and lives to prevent the Japanese from achieving their objective. The naval battle of Guadalcanal offers several enduring lessons about warfare, strategy, and human courage under extreme circumstances. First, it demonstrates how tactical defeats can produce strategic victories. The U.S. Navy lost more ships and men than Japan did in the immediate battle. By traditional measures, it was an American defeat. But the mission succeeded. Henderson Field was not bombarded, and the Japanese offensive was stopped. Sometimes winning means preventing the enemy from achieving their objective, even at a terrible cost. Second, the battle illustrates the importance of willingness to accept risk and casualties for strategic objectives. Admiral Callahan knew his force was outgunned and that many of his ships and men would be lost. He attacked anyway because the alternative, allowing the Japanese to bombard Henderson Field unopposed, was unacceptable. Leadership sometimes requires putting people in situations where the odds are unfavorable because the stakes are too high to avoid the fight. Third, the battle shows how close-run historical turning points can be. If the Japanese bombardment had succeeded, Henderson Field would have been destroyed. Without the airfield, the U.S. couldn't have stopped the Japanese troop transports. Those 13,000 fresh Japanese soldiers likely would have overwhelmed the exhausted Marines defending the island. The entire Guadalcanal campaign might have been lost. But in 30 minutes of desperate fighting in the darkness, American destroyers and cruisers prevented that outcome. Fourth, the battle reminds us of the human cost of strategic decisions. More than 1,400 American sailors died that night. Each one was somebody's son, husband, brother, or father. They died fighting an enemy they could barely see in darkness and confusion far from home. Their sacrifice, multiplied across millions of similar sacrifices by servicemen on all sides, determined the war's outcome and shaped the world we live in today. The naval battle of Guadalcanal resonates in today's strategic environment, particularly regarding the Indo-Pacific region. Once again, great powers compete for influence across Pacific waters. China's growing naval power and territorial assertions in the South China Sea echo, in some ways, Japan's expansion in the 1930s and 1940s. The question of who controls key islands, sea lanes, and airspace remains central to regional security. The battle also reminds us that technology doesn't eliminate the human element in warfare. Despite radar, radio, and other technological advantages, the battle came down to individual sailors making split-second decisions in darkness and chaos. Today's military relies heavily on sophisticated technology, but military effectiveness still ultimately depends on training, leadership, and the willingness of individuals to do dangerous jobs under terrible conditions. The battle illustrates why navies matter for nations with global interests. Control of the seas enabled the United States to project power across the Pacific, supply allies, and ultimately win the war. Today, debates about naval shipbuilding, force structure, and maritime strategy reflect the continuing importance of sea power for nations seeking to protect their interests and fulfill their commitments. Finally, Guadalcanal reminds us that wars are rarely won quickly or easily. The United States entered World War II in December 1941. By November 1942, nearly a year later, American forces were still fighting desperately for a small jungle island most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Victory required sustained commitment over years, massive industrial production, and the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of lives. Quick, easy military victories are the exception, not the rule. When we think about World War II, we often focus on the big picture, the grand strategy, the famous battles, the ultimate victory. But wars are fought by individuals in specific places at specific moments. In the early hours of November 13th, 1942, young American sailors aboard destroyers and cruisers sailed directly toward Japanese battleships, knowing they were outgunned and likely sailing to their deaths. They did it anyway because their mission, protecting Henderson Field, was more important than their survival. We should remember their sacrifice not to glorify war, but to understand its true cost and to ensure that when we ask service members to fight, we do so only when necessary and with full awareness of what we're asking them to risk. The sailors who died off Guadalcanal didn't get to see victory. They died in darkness, many drowning in burning oil or trapped in sinking ships. But their sacrifice helped turn the tide in a war that would determine whether democracy or fascism would dominate the 20th century. Every Veterans Day, November 11th, we honor those who served in America's wars. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought in the early hours of what would have been Veterans Day 1942, reminds us why honoring matters. Those who serve put themselves in harm's way for causes larger than themselves. Understanding what they endure and sacrifice is essential to being informed citizens in a democracy that asks some to fight on behalf of all. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The naval battle of Guadalcanal teaches us about sacrifice, strategic determination, and the human cost of the decisions nations make. Remembering battles like this helps us understand not just history, but the weight of the choices we face when considering military action today. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Richard Backus, and I'll be back tomorrow with another story from our shared past.